Hi friends, welcome to episode 13 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, or when appropriate, I will cite my sources. So whether you're a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. On November 26, just a few weeks ago, Riley Morrison, a 9-year-old girl and basketball player, made a surprising discovery. She is a fan of Stephen Curry, and she wanted very much to wear his Under Armour Curry 5s basketball shoes. She found that these particular shoes were only available as boys' shoes and not for girls. Encouraged by her parents, she wrote Stephen Curry a letter, which was sent to him via Twitter. By the time the basketball star responded 3 days later, on November 29th, his 12.9 million followers learned that Stephen Curry had personally guaranteed Riley that Under Armour was correcting this error. She would be receiving the Curry 5s and the 6s, and he had extended an invitation for her to join him in March for an event commemorating International Women's Day. This heartwarming story was liked nearly 250,000 times and retweeted 35,000 times. I'll attach a link in the show notes. I begin today's episode, A Crisis in the Collection, with this story as it exemplifies how a single letter can cause an almost immediate response to correct an oversight. Today's episode focuses on one title in Capstone Press's You Choose books called War in Afghanistan, an interactive modern history adventure. If you're not familiar with this series, these books are classified as nonfiction and have attractive glossy pages, engaging color photographs, and maps with descriptive captions and boast typically 3-story paths with approximately 30 or more choices and include a multiple possible endings. Readers are given 3 to 4 pages of introduction before they make their first choice. The authors work with consultants who are credited on the title page. The books include a timeline, a glossary, a bibliography, and an index. The back of the book outlines the 3 paths and always states, quote, "Everything in this book happened to real people, and you choose what you do next. The choices you make could lead to your survival or death." End quote. The books are marketed for grades 3 through 6, with a reading level consistently around the 4th grade and average a little more than 100 pages. The very first title in this series I ever purchased was in 2010, and it was the Salem Witch Trials. Readers can choose the path of an accused witch, a family member of an accused witch, or to be an accused witch. It remains the most circulated title within this series, with the Titanic running a close second. In this book, the readers can take on the role of a first-class passenger, a third-class passenger, and finally to be one of the crew. My 5th grade teachers especially like the Colonial America book because it corresponds nicely with one of their social studies units, with 3 paths including that of an indentured servant traveling to Virginia, a young man considering his future as a sailor or soldier, and then finally a boy who must choose sides in the American Revolution. Other titles worth mentioning here are the Civil War spies, which paths include that of a Union spy, a Confederate woman spy, and a free black man spying for the Union. The Pearl Harbor book, whose paths include that of a Japanese pilot, a U.S. Navy sailor, and a U.S. Navy nurse. The World War II spy book includes paths taken by the Denmark Resistance, a German agent, and an American agent. Finally, the paths in the Hurricane Katrina book include that of a child living in the lower 9th Ward, a store owner, and a firefighter. If you couldn't tell already, I'm a huge fan of the series. As a former high school social studies teacher for almost 10 years, I have said more than once to my students, where were these books when I was trying to get my students interested in history? I have 27 titles in my current library and at least 20 in the first library where I worked and taught for 7 years. Because the hardcover copies run $24, it has taken a deliberate effort which extended over years, buying several titles at a time with each book order. On November 1st of this year, Zachary Bell, a veteran of the Afghanistan War, wrote an article for the New York Times titled, "My Deployment Was Not an Adventure, as a Children's Book Tried to Tell My Daughters." A link is provided in the show notes. It is a very difficult read and traces, among other things, the questions his daughters raised as they read Capstone's War in Afghanistan. I do not have any living family members in the armed forces, and that undoubtedly influences how I respond to the actions taken by Capstone Press when this article was published. I missed this story when it initially came out. Reading the over 85 responses in the online readers forum, which ran the gamut from thanks and praise from fellow veterans and civilians alike to a few anger-filled responses from those claiming to speak on behalf of the civilian casualties caught in the crossfire. At least one reader suggested that Zachary Bell author his own historical account. I found out this week that Capstone actually issued a press release on its official blog, Capstone Connect, on November 5th, a fact which this blog isn't easily accessed from their official website is a question that I raised when Capstone called me on Monday. Their November 5th statement reads, quote, "For 27 years, Capstone has been a trusted publisher of children's books, helping kids develop a love of reading and learning, no matter their ability, is at the heart of what we do. We work hard to create books that will truly engage children who otherwise do not want to read. One of our best-selling series to exemplify this is our line of You Choose books, which includes more than 100 titles from the Titanic to the Great Depression and Apollo 11 moon landing. History comes alive and is filled with possibilities as readers decide which paths they will take inside each story." Recently, former Marine infantryman Zachary Bell shared his powerful, thought-provoking story in a New York Times Magazine article, which has given us reason to pause. In this case, Mr. Bell pointed out that our You Choose book, The War in Afghanistan, went too far. We are humbled by his important and articulate thoughts, and we agree. Upon reflection, we have decided to stop selling this title and will no longer publish it moving forward. We have begun a process to review all our books that contain similar themes and content. This has been an eye-opening experience, and we thank Mr. Bell for bringing this to our attention and starting an important dialogue. End quote. I actually only became aware of this story on December 1st, when I was catching up on the New York Times online. I read C.J. Chivers' A Marine's Reaction to a Children's Book Prompts an Apology from the Publisher, posted on November 30th, 2018. See the show notes for a link. I was so fired up about reading this article that I left my earbuds at home while I was walking my dogs on Sunday morning, just so I could hear my own ideas swirling around in my head. With the benefit of a week to reflect on my own attitudes and philosophy regarding the collection development, I decided to proceed with this podcast episode, despite however unpopular my position may be to others. I toyed around with the idea of contributing to the New York Times online forum over the years, but I was finally moved to write last Sunday, after reading about Capstone's decision to stop publishing the War in Afghanistan book, and especially in response to the quote by Capstone publisher Patricia Stockland, who said in the New York Times article, quote, "I do wish we could also take them out of circulation, but as we know, words don't work like that," end quote. I added my thoughts to what would become 31 total responses saying, quote, What about the school librarians and history teachers, no doubt, who have purchased and promoted this entire series for more than 10 years? This isn't E. coli. I've never had a publisher recall books with the intention of destroying them. And to those who say war isn't an appropriate topic for 10 and 11-year-olds, these books fly off my school library shelves, as do the ones on the flu pandemic of 1918, the Titanic, and Pompeii. How else do we pique the interest of young students, thus inspiring a curiosity and love of history, if not with books? And then I ended my entry with a quote. A truly great library contains something in it to offend everybody, end quote. And I don't have the attribution for that quote, and every time I looked for it, I found something on Pinterest, which wasn't very helpful. As with the November 1st article, the November 30th article prompted an enormous range of comments. Some disputed the appropriateness of such a topic for 8 to 10-year-olds. There were several posts objecting to the war in Afghanistan, though not necessarily to the book, and others who felt the book should have never been published in the first place. One especially memorable post from Philadelphia, whose backhanded compliment mentioned the author, in this case Zachary Bell, was articulate and effective, as if Marines aren't known for those attributes, and then said, quote, an apology and pulling a few titles is not enough. Also, we're letting the library off the hook, end quote. I am dying to know what this individual would have proposed. That particular lengthy comment never gave any details of what action the author would have felt appropriate against the local library, which had this book in their collection. There were, on the other hand, some comments on the New York Times forum which took a decidedly different position. And I very much admire writers who are succinct. If I possessed such a skill, these episodes would be knocked out in about 10 minutes tops. Such as it is, I'm cursed with verbosity and an apparent love of hearing my own voice. One reader from Vermont said, quote, it sets a worrying precedent by establishing how easy it may be in this era of intellectual timidity for members of the public to veto entire topics from being dealt with by publishers, end quote. A Massachusetts reader wrote, quote, the purpose of a story is to pass on the knowledge embedded in it, unquote. I was the only respondent to identify as a school librarian, or any other type of librarian for that matter, in the forum, and as the day continued, I spent some time on Capstone's website and, not finding any press release regarding this issue, decided to send an email to their customer service department. I pasted my New York Times comment in the body of the message. I mentioned the situation in the closing of last week's podcast and on the AASL's online message board. I am very fortunate to have an elementary library friend who will entertain my Sunday rants. Between the two of us, we usually share all the relevant New York Times articles that week and have what can best be described as a prolonged exchange of text throughout the day. We often disagree, but I value her feedback as it is timely and thoughtful. And if you've ever felt the frustration of sending out work-related emails and hearing nothing but crickets in response, you learn to appreciate when a friend recognizes just how much this means to you, the sender. She raised some good points. She texted, quote, surprised Capstone hadn't realized that a real, recent, and ongoing military conflict might be problematic topic for the series, end quote. She then added, this sounds a bit like the print equivalent of a first-person shooter video game. I have a huge problem with making the underbelly of human experience into interactive entertainment, she continues. Having it based on real events is a huge responsibility, and one they miscued, I gather. And how could they not? Surely we don't want our choosers to experience even vicariously the brutal decisions and consequences of the battlefield. And I'm sorry, but I completely reject the notion of equating war with adventure, though I know our armed forces recruiters beg to differ. end quote. She later texted that, quote, even at high school, I think many readers would need to be guided towards thoughtful reflection, end quote. And on this point, I do want to disagree. As I explain later, students must be free to explore topics independently of teachers' instruction. I feel it is unreasonable to expect that contentious world events would only be addressed with students under the leadership of an informed educator. Then I countered my friend with a text reminding her that we all have books about the sinking of the Titanic and Salem witch trials and Pompeii in our collections. And my friend replied, quote, but all safely long ago, so the brutality, though certainly there, doesn't have the same need for softening that led to inappropriate, quote-unquote, breeziness. My friend continues, quote, I imagine if those events were fresher in people's personal experience, parentheses, whether first person or reading newspaper accounts, end parentheses, there would be complaints of undue breeziness in them too. She continues, but time lends its own insulation and therefore, for better or worse, makes them safer for kids to explore. The reader's imagination controls how much brutality they include, and for me, no guns in those examples, so no choices about directly causing harm or death, end quote. And I would like to mention at that point, this is the exact precise reason that Capstone gave me when they followed up with a call on Monday. I'll elaborate. So on Monday, I got a call during a class I was teaching from Capstone. And I asked if they would kindly return the call after 11:05, and as luck would have it, the teacher was 3 minutes late, so the Capstone caller got to listen to me dismissing my third graders. It is fair to say that I have zero experience in investigative reporting, and I was hoping that my many years as a devoted listener of Terry Gross and Fresh Air would have endowed me with some interviewing finesse. That would not be the case, as I soon discovered. When I asked the caller if I was speaking to customer service, I was told that my email had been bumped up, and I was actually speaking to the senior marketing director for Capstone. I am now officially nowhere near my comfort zone during this phone call. I didn't ask for her name, and she didn't offer it. She did her best to emphasize that Capstone was in no way suggesting a recall of the War in Afghanistan books from our library shelves. I reminded her of Patricia Stockland's quote expressing a wish to pull the books from circulation. The explanation the director gave me was that the recall was not her intention and that the quote was poorly phrased. She explained that the individual libraries were free to make their own decisions with regards to continuing or discontinuing circulating this book, and that yes, booksellers like Follett might still have a few copies in their warehouses. The director emphasized repeatedly that this book didn't represent Capstone's values or their best work, and, in light of recent school shootings, believed it was best to pull this and other several modern warfare titles in production. I made it clear that I was a huge fan, and I had invested over $600 in 2 school libraries on the You Choose series. The director assured me that Capstone would be happy to refund the cost of this book should we decide to pull it from circulation. I asked why Capstone decided to stop publishing this book because of one concern expressed by a veteran. She explained that Capstone fields issues raised by readers every day. Capstone takes all of these concerns seriously. She reassured me that oftentimes, once Capstone looks into the specifics of these critiques, the decision is made to proceed with production. I did take this opportunity to express some frustration with their website design and the misleading news link, as it did not lead me to official press releases after all. Rather, the official press release was posted on a separate blog, which the director admitted isn't easy to find navigating the website. When I Googled, quote, Capstone Response Afghanistan War, end quote, their press release was the 5th item produced in the search. Before I ended our call, I did share with the director that I had no intention of pulling the book from circulation. I have had past experience receiving concerned parent emails regarding questionable material in my collection, and I have never received such an email regarding any of the titles in the You Choose series. During the week, I checked back with the AASL online discussion board. I wasn't expecting a consensus. I am reminded that school librarians are independently minded, and the communities we serve are unique, and our libraries are customized to support the students in our school. Mary from New York posted, quote, "Capstone was trying to make their books read like video games are played. This should not have been their approach. Most parents do not expect this type of content to come out of their school libraries. I understand the reaction, especially from a vet of these wars. What would a World War II vet have done if this came out in the 1950s and his or her children were exposed to it?" End quote. Michael, an elementary school librarian, said, quote, "The choose-your-own-adventure format has been around forever, and the strength of the decision-making that you are forced to take on. I think this is a terrible mistake on Capstone's part, and if they are really destroying the books based on one essay from one person, that is beyond the pale." End quote. And finally, Karen from Mississippi wrote a longer post, and I do want to share it in full. It is very clear that, like me, Karen is processing the implications of the collections we create and the readers we serve. Karen writes, quote, "Wow, I don't think I can express what I'm feeling right now. I just read your entry and then went and read Zachary Bell's post. I do not have these books, but have them on a wish list. I will be removing them next from my wish list. So many of my students are military families, and I cannot imagine having one of them read this book and think war is as simple as the book makes it out to be. That being said, I also realize that 4th and 5th graders cannot possibly understand the true actions and consequences of war. I won't presume to tell you what to do about removing the book from your library. I know I would pull it immediately and then go through each of the other books in the series with a fine-tooth comb. Due to so many of my families being military, and unfortunately several students losing parents in this war over the past few years, I am very careful about what I have on the shelves and what I read aloud. I have many, many books on military equipment, vehicles, branches, work, etc., but I'm always aware of books that go into too much depth on actual combat in my elementary school library, presumably. Those types of books are vetted and placed in my high school library. This is something that we as school and children librarians will have to address on an ongoing basis for the foreseeable future. There is no way to read every book that comes in, but perhaps we need to be more aware of some topics." End quote. I really appreciate the readers who have chosen to provide me with such valuable feedback, and I do find Karen's feedback especially eye-opening. I want to continue. I understand the objections made by Zachary Bell and those made by the New York Times readers and fellow librarians. However, I feel personally removing the books from a collection, preventing students from accessing them, is never the answer. As a New York Times reader from Tucson said, the book, quote, albeit disrespectful, any discussion about Afghanistan, flawed as it may be, is better than silence, end quote. I don't expect this book, or any book which tackles a complicated topic, to be a definitive text, to be the only book our students ever need to consult. Quite the contrary. Our students, when they read and decide to read more, there is where our students' understanding becomes nuanced, and they ask the questions which invites additional exploration. Waiting to introduce the war in Afghanistan until the curriculum has determined it is appropriate and a teacher schedules this lesson is just not serving the best interests of our students. I am looking forward to Monday. I'm shadowing a fellow school librarian in a nearby public elementary school in a district about 40 minutes away. I have a contractual requirement called instructional rounds each year to observe someone. We have the freedom to pick the day and the time, either one full day or divided into 2 half-days. Most teachers visit classrooms in other buildings, but we are welcome to go outside of our own district. Because I've taught in 8 of our own 9 elementary schools, I find I learn so much more when I venture out into the other districts. I do like to arrive before the students, and I take photos of the shelves and displays and furniture configurations. I'll swap lesson plans over lunch, and I always come back with lots of ideas of how to adapt what I've seen into my own library. I've always appreciated this opportunity, and if your district doesn't have something similar, it is definitely worth asking. I would like to thank you all for listening today. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Share this podcast with other school librarians in your district and your PLN. Consider leaving a ratings at iTunes as it helps other school librarians learn about this podcast. I would like to thank composer Nazar Ryback at hooksounds.com for the music you've heard today. As always, I invite your feedback and contributions. Please email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. The topic of our next episode will be, for lack of a more clever title, The Holidays in Your Library. I hope you will tune in.